The night is still, and through its hush you may hear the echo of a bell, slow and solemn, as though carried from the depths of time. Beneath the stones of Jerusalem, in crypts lit only by trembling torchlight, the Knights Templar were said to have uncovered relics. Not of gold or silver, but of parchment, fragile and ink faded. Some whispered that within those scrolls lay fragments of the story of Moses, a story that has shaped faiths and nations, yet remains filled with silences, contradictions, and mysteries. Egypt's records, so meticulous, tell nothing of Exodus. The scriptures themselves bear the marks of many hands, voices stitched together across centuries, leaving behind a figure who feels at once intimate and distant, lawgiver and prophet, liberator and legend. Perhaps Moses was never one man, but a vessel of many voices. Perhaps the miracles were symbols, crafted to bind a people with law more enduring than conquest. Or perhaps there are truths still hidden, waiting beneath stone and silence. Tonight, we follow both parchment and rumour, history and legend, tracing how a single story became a bridge across cultures, and why the Templars stand watch within it. This is Serene Myths. If you find yourself drawn into the quiet unravelling of ancient mysteries, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a comment with the place and the hour where you've joined us. Your words will linger here as part of the vigil. And now, as the bell fades, let us descend into the crypt, where the knights wait beside a sealed chest, and the first whispers of the story begin. The bell tolled once in the night, heavy and resonant, as though struck not by a mortal hand, but by the slow breath of the earth itself. The Knights Templar, clad in steel that glimmered faintly against the torches, moved in silence through the crypt beneath Jerusalem, their boots pressed against stones worn smooth by centuries of prayer, stones that seemed to remember every footstep, every whispered vow. The air was thick with dust, incense, and the scent of oil from their lamps. They were guardians, yet also seekers, drawn to the hidden corners of history, where shadows held the weight of unsolved mysteries. In the stillness of that subterranean chamber, there lay an ark-like chest, its wood darkened with age, bound in iron bands, etched with symbols no one could wholly decipher. The Templars had no certainty of what rested inside, only fragments of rumour, shards of story carried across deserts and seas. Some whispered that these were not relics of saints or bones of martyrs, but manuscripts, ancient scrolls, fragile and ink-faded, whose words had survived kingdoms and empires. They believed that inside might lie texts older than the Crusades, older even than Christendom, fragments reaching back into the long corridors of the Hebrew past. The idea itself was intoxicating. What if the story of Moses, the great lawgiver, the one whose shadow stretched across Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike, had been stitched together from many hands? And what if the Templars, digging through the earth of Jerusalem, brushing away soil from ancient stone, had stumbled upon echoes of that very truth? The tale, as most of the world knows it, is singular. A man chosen by God, raised in the house of Pharaoh, leading his people through parted seas into covenant and law. But beneath the poetry, the symbols, the miracles, what if there had always been the murmur of multiple voices, a chorus hidden beneath the melody? It was not only the question of authorship that mattered, there was also the silence, a silence as weighty as the toll of the bell above. Egypt, meticulous keeper of records, left no word of a mass departure, no trace of a people fleeing under the cover of plague and storm. Their scribes carved victories, treaties, even dreams into stone, yet on the Exodus they wrote nothing. Some scholars suggest that this silence is an argument against the story's historicity. Others argue that absence proves little, that Egypt recorded what glorified kings, not what shamed them. To the Templar mind, trained to read absence as presence, silence was a cipher. In the courts of power, silence is rarely empty. It is deliberate, purposeful, a veil over something too dangerous to name. Imagine walking beside those knights, torchlight flickering against ancient walls. The iron chest before them is heavy not only with wood and parchment, but with questions. What if Moses was not one man, but many? What if the burning bush and the thunder of Sinai were metaphors, woven threads from different regions, different centuries, gathered like relics into one reliquary? The Templars themselves had long dealt with layered texts, the Gospels copied, translated, glossed. They knew the hand of the editor is often as powerful as that of the author. And in the shifting sands of the Near East, stories too were weapons, binding communities, conferring authority, shaping law. There are passages in the Torah where stories repeat with subtle variations, where God is called by one name in one scene and by another name in the next, where commands are duplicated but phrased differently, where contradictions stand side by side, as if the scribes had been unwilling or unable to choose. To a casual reader, these may appear as slips of memory, but to a trained eye, they are fingerprints, the mark of multiple hands. Centuries later, scholars would call it the documentary hypothesis, identifying strands they named J, E, D, and P, each with its own cadence, its own vision of the divine, but perhaps the Templars glimpsed it first. Not in academic treatises, but in fragments unearthed beneath the Temple Mount. Fragments that told them stories can be assembled like mosaics. The silence of Egypt becomes, in this view, a kind of negative space. Just as the blank parchment between letters allows meaning to emerge, the absence of records may be the most eloquent record of all. Did the Egyptians deliberately erase? Did they consider the event too small to note? Or did they see nothing because the event as told was less a happening in the desert than a happening in memory, reshaped by generations? The knights, accustomed to guarding secrets, understood how stories could be bent into armor. To them, the Exodus was not diminished by being legend. It was magnified because legend is a kind of truth that endures when facts perish. In the crypt, one knight brushed his hand against the chest, feeling the cool iron, hearing the faint creak of hinges not opened for centuries. The candlelight revealed his face half in shadow, half in glow. He knew that what lay within might never see the sun again. Perhaps the scrolls were already brittle dust. Perhaps they contained nothing more than genealogies, rituals, and fragments of law. Yet even that would be enough, for in those words, whether law or legend, lay the authority that could bind a people together. And authority, as the knights knew, is more enduring than sword or spear. It outlives the clangor of battle. It whispers through parchment long after steel has rusted. The bell tolled again above, deep and slow. It was not a call to arms, but a reminder of the passing of time. Outside the crypt, the city of Jerusalem lay hushed under a veil of stars, its stones still warm from the day's sun, its air laced with the scents of olive and dust. Inside, the knights lingered, caught between reverence and dread. If they had found fragments of the Moses tradition, then they were holding in their hands not only history, but myth, not only memory, but meaning. And as they gazed upon the chest, the thought came like a whisper. Perhaps Moses was never meant to be one man. Perhaps he was a vessel, a gathering of voices, an echo chamber through which God spoke differently to each generation. Step closer in your mind. Hear the scrape of iron against stone, the flutter of parchment when a chest is opened. Smell the mingling of incense and old leather. Feel the gravity of words that have travelled centuries to find their way into your imagination. The knights understood that stories are alive, that they change with each retelling. that they are vessels carrying both truth and invention, and as the chest groaned open, dust rising in slow spirals, the night itself seemed to lean closer, as though listening. The opening of that chest is not just a moment in the crypt, it is an invitation. It draws us into the labyrinth where silence speaks, where contradictions reveal design, where history dissolves into legend, and legend hardens into law. From the Templars' steel-bound vigil, the path now winds backward, into the deserts of Egypt and Canaan, into the scrolls written and rewritten across centuries, where the question remains like an ember. Who really wrote the story of Moses, and why? The mist of history thickens, the bell fades into echo, and step by step we descend deeper into the mystery. The crypt fades into silence, yet the echo of the Templar bell lingers, carrying us far beyond the stone walls of Jerusalem. The story bends southward, down the Nile, into the golden corridors of Egypt. Here lies a puzzle that has confounded both priest and scholar. The meticulous records of pharaohs, carved with such precision that even grain tallies and fishing quotas were memorialized, remain utterly silent on the Exodus. The absence is deafening, as though one expected a symphony but found only blank parchment. Egyptian scribes were famed for their diligence. Their hieroglyphs recorded wars won and wars lost, the rise and fall of floods, the dreams of kings, even the omens observed in the flight of birds. To those trained in reading these inscriptions, it is as though the land itself spoke through chisels and pigments, and yet, nowhere among the triumphs, nowhere among the laments, is there a word of a nation of slaves departing en masse, guided by miracles, shattering the power of Pharaoh through plagues and sea crossing. It is as though the event, if it happened, left no ripple on the surface of Egypt's pride. This silence is often wielded as an argument against historicity. Modern historians point out that Egypt, for all its grandeur, did not hesitate to record defeat if it could be framed as moral lesson or divine trial. Yet others remind us that archives were not neutral spaces. Pharaohs directed what should be remembered and what should be erased. To inscribe an embarrassment was to immortalize it. To omit was to bury it. Perhaps the Exodus, if real, was deemed unworthy of record, too humiliating to carve into stone. Or perhaps it was not an exodus at all, but a much smaller migration, later magnified by memory and song. Step into that silence for a moment. Imagine standing before a temple wall, its hieroglyphs still sharp under torchlight. You trace your fingers along the neat rows, lists of tribute from Nubia, tallies of cattle from Canaan, prayers to Ra at dawn. The stone is dense with memory. Yet on the one event you seek, it is mute. The absence becomes its own kind of presence, pressing against you like a sealed door. The Templars, steeped in the arts of secrecy, would not have dismissed this void. To them, the missing inscription might have been more revealing than any carved boast. In espionage, they knew, what is unsaid often carries greater weight than what is declared. One knight, gazing into the gap of history, may have wondered, what if silence itself is a language? Egypt's blankness could be a deliberate act, a choice to deny power to the memory of escape. By refusing to carve it, Pharaoh denied its permanence, and yet the Hebrews did the opposite. They retold, recopied, and exalted the tale until it became the cornerstone of their identity. Silence in one tradition became proclamation in another, two mirrors facing each other across centuries. Here, the imagination strays to what might have lain in the Templar's chest. Perhaps there were marginal notes, commentaries written in exile, debating why Egypt left no trace. Perhaps the scribes of Israel themselves knew the silence, and rather than seeing it as a weakness, turned it into strength. After all, what is faith if not the act of proclaiming in the face of void? to assert that God acted even when the world refused to notice. The absence of Egyptian confirmation could have served to heighten the divine paradox. Israel remembered what the empire erased. There is a quirk often overlooked. Egyptian scribes sometimes rewrote their own past, chiseling out names of disgraced pharaohs, erasing dynasties from walls. Erasure was not failure of record, but policy of record. What if the Exodus fell victim to this same hand? To imagine a pharaoh chiseled away is to imagine the Exodus chiseled away beside him. And though stone holds firm, silence can be more enduring still. The debate, however, is far from resolved. Some argue that archaeology in the Sinai and Delta does not support a mass wandering. Campsites, pottery, bones, none appear in the numbers the biblical narrative suggests. Others argue the opposite. Desert sands shift, and nomadic traces are the faintest of all. The quarrel is ongoing, with no verdict, only layers of conjecture. Scholars wrestle with absence, trying to turn it into evidence, while believers turn absence into mystery, both seeking meaning in the void. The Templars, guarding their vaults, knew that voids themselves were dangerous. A blank page can invite endless interpretations. And so, in their rituals, silence was codified, structured, given shape. One can imagine a knight staring at hieroglyphs and thinking, if Pharaoh carved nothing, then perhaps God intended us to carve memory instead. Thus absence becomes assignment. The stillness of Egypt's archives mirrors the stillness of the crypt in Jerusalem. Both hum with what is not spoken. Both beckon the listener deeper, urging them to seek where no inscription points. From here, the journey shifts from stone walls and chiseled gaps to the very timeline of composition. If Egypt is silent, then we must ask, when truly were these stories written? The next step draws us from void into ink, from Pharaoh's refusal to the scribe's creation. The bell of the Templars fades, replaced by the scratching of quills, marking centuries after the events they describe. The silence of Egypt gives way to the slow birth of scripture. The hush of Egypt's stone walls gives way to the scratching of quills, the slow unfolding of time itself. We leave behind the monuments of pharaohs and move instead into the manuscripts, into the quiet rooms where scribes bent over parchment and clay, their lamplight burning against the dark. It is here that the story of Moses, as we know it, was stitched together. Not in the moment of Exodus, but centuries later, when memory had weathered into myth and myth had hardened into scripture. If one traces the timeline, the gulf becomes clear. The earliest fragments of the narrative may date to the 10th century before Christ, long after the supposed events of the Exodus would have unfolded. Later layers appear during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century, or even after, when Israel's identity had been shattered by conquest and dispersal. The tale of Moses was not born in the desert's dust. It was born in the trauma of exile, in the longing to hold together a fractured people. Imagine the distance, to write in the shadow of Babylon about events that, if historical, belonged to the distant memory of ancestors several hundred years gone. It is as though we today try to write the eyewitness chronicle of Columbus, not by records from his time, but by oral tales retold across centuries. This gap is not trivial. It changes how one breathes the story. Each century of delay is like another layer of dust on a relic, softening its lines, inviting new carvings over the old. Generations of scribes did not merely preserve, they interpreted, reshaped, selected, and harmonized. The narrative became a palimpsest, a layered painting, where one color seeps through the cracks of another. This is why contradictions remain, because erasing them would have meant erasing the voices of tribes who claimed those words as their own. The editors were less concerned with factual neatness than with sacred inclusivity. They wove a fabric that was stronger for its knots and seams. Picture, if you will, a parchment unrolled on a cedar table. The ink has faded to sepia, the edges curled from handling. A scribe dips his reed into ink, pauses, then writes of the bush that burned yet was not consumed. But the scribe is not recording a fresh event. He is transmitting a tale inherited, reshaped by centuries of telling. His work is not history, as we might think of it, but an act of preservation, of sanctification, of codifying identity. The Exodus becomes a vessel, holding centuries of longing and political theology. It is no wonder then that when we read, we sometimes find duplications, divergences, shifts in tone. They are the fingerprints of different times. The Templars, attuned to the passing of ages, would have recognized this pattern. They knew how the centuries refract memory, how relics are reinterpreted with each generation that claims them. To a knight, the span between Exodus and exile might not diminish the tale, but elevate it, turning it into a timeless parable. For was it not their own order that crafted rituals steeped in symbols from older ages? Did they not march beneath a red cross whose meaning had been borrowed and reimagined countless times before? In this way, they too lived within timelines that stretched beyond their own lifetimes, bridging past and present through ritual and story. A curious quirk emerges when we think of this timeline. The Hebrew scribes who shaped these texts were often living under foreign domination: Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian. To tell the story of liberation in such a context was itself a radical act. The Exodus narrative became a mirror, a rehearsal of identity, a script reminding them that bondage would not have the final word. And yet, its composition so long after the fact suggests that the historical event, if it occurred, was already obscured. The people did not simply record what they saw, they reconstructed what they needed. The debate grows here, sharp and unresolved. Some argue that such a distance between event and text undermines all historicity. How could details survive intact when centuries intervened? Others contend that oral traditions are resilient, that memories preserved in ritual and song can outlast empires. Songs sung at hearths, prayers whispered in exile, could indeed carry fragments of real memory across the generations. The truth may be neither simple nor singular, myth and history entwined like vines, each lending strength to the other. Imagine a timeline drawn on parchment, with one line marking the supposed age of Moses and Exodus, another showing the centuries of monarchy, and another the exile in Babylon. The gap yawns between them. To modernize, it seems a void, but to those who lived through exile, it was an opportunity to reinterpret, to find meaning in survival. The timeline is not a wound, it is a loom. Through it, the scribes wove a garment to clothe their people in dignity despite conquest. The Templars, when they handled their own archives, were also curators of absence. Documents lost in battle, charters eaten by fire, were replaced by ritual memory. They knew that a blank can be filled with liturgy, that silence can be given form through symbol. In their eyes, the centuries between Exodus and exile might not weaken the story at all. Instead, they might have seen in it a parallel to their own endurance. Knights preserving memory across crusades, across the rise and fall of kingdoms, their bell tolling through changing ages. Step closer in your imagination. The quill scratches, the ink pools in the curve of a Hebrew letter. A scribe in Babylonian exile pauses to hear the evening laments of his people. Then he bends again, writing of plagues, of seas, of deliverance. He is not writing mere nostalgia. He is building a bridge, tying his shattered present to a triumphant myth of a liberation. And in so doing, he secures hope for generations unborn. The parchment before him is more than text. It is survival pressed into words. The air of the scriptorium is heavy with smoke from oil lamps, with the murmur of chanting as words are copied aloud to preserve their rhythm. The scribes chant not because they witnessed, but because chanting ensures continuity. The story becomes part of the bloodstream of the people. It matters less when it happened, more that it continues to be told. And that is the paradox. The timeline may widen into centuries, but the narrative compresses those centuries into a single, eternal present. The bell of the Templars tolls once more in our minds, reminding us of the way time itself can sanctify. Just as their order layered new rituals atop old stones, so too did Israel's scribes layer memory upon memory, law upon law, until a new scripture emerged. And, as the knights might have whispered to one another in the crypt, sometimes it is the very delay that makes the story sacred, because it becomes not a moment, but a tradition. The path, traced through silence and timeline, now turns deeper still. From the wide span of centuries, our gaze narrows to the very voices woven into the text. If the tale was composed long after, then whose voices were gathered there? Who are J, E, D, and P, the four singers in the choir of Scripture? And how did their melodies shape the figure of Moses? The quill pauses, the lamp flickers, and the parchment waits for the next hand. The story is ready to divide into its many voices. The parchment lies unrolled, its edges curled with time, its ink faded but not forgotten. Out of the layered centuries, a pattern begins to emerge, subtle at first, then undeniable. Scholars call it the documentary hypothesis, but to imagine it in its own age is to picture a choir of four voices, each with its own timbre, each singing of God and Moses in tones distinct yet woven together. The Templars, if they had brushed their hands across such scrolls, might have thought of it as a chant heard in the cloisters, sometimes in harmony, sometimes in dissonance, but always part of one sacred liturgy. One voice is earthy, intimate, filled with images of dust and soil, where God walks beside humankind as though in a garden at dusk. This is the Yahwist, or J, who calls the divine by a personal name. Another voice is loftier, more distant, a God who speaks through dreams, intermediaries, and veils. This is the Elohist, or E, a voice shaped by the wind-swept hills of the northern kingdom. Then comes D, the Deuteronomist, who writes with the cadence of covenant lawsuits, blessing and curse woven like thunder and whisper. Finally P, the priestly writer, meticulous and formal, obsessed with order, ritual, and lineage, as though each word must mirror the symmetry of the heavens. When read aloud, their differences are undeniable. One will say God appeared directly. Another insists it was through an angel. One tells of the waters parting with a blast of wind. Another leaves the mechanism vague, a miracle beyond measure. One traces ancestry with lists of names. Another leaps straight into narrative. For centuries, readers took these as variations of one story, but under the careful gaze of scholars, they resolve into distinct voices. To the Templars, guardians of layered liturgies, such multiplicity would not have been surprising. They too recited prayers stitched from fragments of earlier ages, chants that carried the echo of many tongues. Imagine standing in a dim library, the air thick with the musk of vellum. You unroll one scroll and hear J's voice, vivid, human, almost tender. You unroll another and hear E, austere, fearful of divine intimacy. Together they form not contradiction, but tension, a dialogue that stretches across kingdoms. The Deuteronomist enters with the solemn thunder of covenant, his voice resonant like the toll of a great bell. Then P, the priest, adds order, structure, an architecture of words that frames the sacred into something enduring. Each voice alone is partial, but together they form the tapestry of Moses, A curious detail arises when comparing these voices. J describes God as Yahweh from the earliest days, while E hesitates, reserving the name until Sinai. Such a divergence may seem trivial, yet it reveals how communities understood the divine differently. To one, God was near, present, called by name. To the other, God was distant, approached only with trembling. In this difference lies the seed of theological debate that would echo for millennia. And still, in the final compilation, both perspectives were preserved. The editors did not erase one voice to privilege another. They bound them together, trusting that the contradictions themselves carried meaning. The Templars would have seen in this not confusion, but mystery, for in their own rituals, opposing symbols stood side by side. The sword and the cross, the vow of poverty and the wealth of treasure, the humility of the monk and the power of the knight. To them, paradox was not failure, but a doorway to deeper truth. So too with the voices of Moses. To let the contradictions stand was to admit that the divine could not be captured by one perspective alone. There is something haunting about this choir of texts. J writes with the scent of soil and pasture, as though the shepherd's world shaped his theology. E brings the cold winds of the north, where prophets dreamed of ladders stretching into heaven. D writes with the cadence of courtroom and covenant, reminding his people that obedience meant survival. Disobedience meant ruin. P writes as a builder, every law another stone in the invisible temple of identity. Each voice emerges from a different land, a different century, yet in the scrolls they kneel together, like pilgrims around the same fire. The debate is whether this hypothesis reveals the truth of the text or imposes an artificial order. Some scholars argue that the divisions are too neat, that the texts were not written by distinct authors, but represent evolving traditions intertwined. Others find the fingerprints too clear to deny. The repeated stories, the changes in divine names, the stylistic shifts, they testify to multiple hands. To critics, the model fractures the unity of Scripture. To others, it reveals the depth of its construction. The argument endures, unresolved, echoing like the counterpoint of the voices themselves. Picture yourself tracing the lines with your finger, noticing how a passage in Exodus will shift tone within a single breath. One moment intimate, the next distant, the next liturgical. The scroll seems alive, like a choir whose singers overlap, handing melody from one to another. To read it this way is to hear the polyphony beneath the surface, the voices of J, E, D, and P rising and falling like the waves of a chant. The Templars, listening in their midnight vigils, may have thought of it as a divine mystery hidden in plain sight, a secret encoded in the very fabric of holy words. In their crypts, the Knights preserved charters and codes, each rewritten by successive hands. They knew that texts were never pure, never untouched. Each copy introduced change, whether intentional or accidental. To them, the layered voices of Moses would have seemed natural, even inevitable. A sacred story worthy of survival was one that could absorb difference, could bear the weight of contradiction. And so, perhaps, they found not scandal, but confirmation in the discovery of multiple voices. The parchment curls, the ink fades, but the choir continues. 4 voices, distinct yet bound, singing of deliverance, of covenant, of law. Their song would echo through centuries, shaping identity, guiding faith, inspiring revolutions. And from the crypt of Jerusalem to the deserts of Sinai, from Babylon to the courts of scholars, the question remains: is this multiplicity a flaw or the very mark of divinity? The answer is left suspended, like the final chord of a chant lingering in the vaulted air. The choir of J, E, D, and P is not the end, but the beginning of the journey. For once we recognize the voices, we are drawn to follow them more closely, to hear each in turn, to see how their melodies clash and entwine. The parchment waits, the ink darkens under lamplight, and the story prepares to divide itself further into the intimate and the distant, the covenantal and the priestly. The chant beckons us forward, deeper into the labyrinth of Scripture. The choir of voices begins to separate now, the melody dividing into its strands. To follow the thread of J and E is to walk two different landscapes, each shaping the image of God and Moses in its own likeness. Their contrast is not merely scholarly theory. It is the echo of two kingdoms, Judah in the south and Israel in the north, each with its fears, its politics, its sacred imagination. The Yahwist, J, speaks with the warmth of the southern hills, where shepherds moved through olive groves and vineyards stretched under the sun. Here God is near, intimate, walking in gardens, speaking face to face, calling Moses by name. It is a voice full of earthiness, rich in imagery, woven with the dust of pastures. J's Moses is a man reluctant yet chosen, flawed yet bound by destiny, a leader whose humanity is never hidden. This voice tells stories not as distant myth, but as fireside memory, tales handed down to unify the fractured tribes of Judah under the claim of divine calling. By contrast, the Elohist, E, rises from the northern windswept highlands, a land more precarious, threatened by surrounding powers. In this voice, God is remote, a sovereign not easily approached. Revelation comes through dreams, through angels, through intermediaries. The divine is shrouded, hidden behind veils. For E, the point is not intimacy, but transcendence. His Moses is less approachable, more shrouded in awe. In a time when kings in the north sought to claim divine authority, E's theology curbed their ambitions. If God spoke only through visions and intermediaries, then no king could claim direct access. Power was checked by distance, holiness guarded by mystery. To imagine these voices is to imagine two communities speaking to one another through story. One says, God is with us, walking beside us, leading us by hand. The other says, God is above us, beyond us, a fire too great to touch. Together, they form a tension that still shapes faith today, the yearning for intimacy and the reverence of transcendence. Both are necessary, and both were preserved, because erasing one would have silenced half a people. Step into the world of J for a moment. You walk through Judah's fields at twilight, the scent of pressed grapes lingering in the air. A shepherd lifts his eyes to the hills and speaks of a God who is close, who calls leaders from the humble, who chooses the hesitant and makes them strong. Now step into the world of E. The northern winds whip across the highlands, carrying the cry of prophets who dream strange dreams, who hear God's voice only through angels, who tremble before the distance of heaven. You feel the difference not only in theology, but in air, in soil, in light. The quirks of their writing reveal their worlds. J lingers on the personal, giving characters emotions and dialogue, letting the drama unfold like a play. E prefers brevity, distance, visions that dissolve at dawn. One tells stories of God forming man from dust, breathing life into nostrils. The other prefers God speaking from a mountaintop, untouchable, mediated, and in the figure of Moses, these differences converge. In J, Moses hesitates, pleads, bargains with a God he knows well enough to protest. In E, Moses receives messages through veils, a servant to a God whose fire cannot be seen directly. It is debated whether J and E were truly separate documents, or whether they represent regional traditions later woven together. Some scholars suggest they were rival accounts, competing for authority, later harmonized by editors unwilling to discard either. Others argue the distinctions are blurred, that what we see as J and E are strands of a more fluid oral tradition. Yet even if blurred, the duality is unmistakable. The contradictions, two names for God, two callings of Moses, two accounts of revelation, bear the mark of divergent origins. The Templars, had they unrolled these scrolls, might have thought of their own divided world. They lived between monk and knight, prayer and sword, east and west. To them, J and E would not have been rival voices, but reflections of the paradox they themselves embodied. They knew that truth often resides not in resolution, but in balance, the holding of opposites in tension. As they guarded Jerusalem's relics, they too carried the contradiction of being both humble servants and powerful warriors. In the crypt's torchlight, one might imagine a knight lifting two fragments of parchment. On one, J speaks with the warmth of intimacy. On the other, E whispers with the chill of distance. The knight sees not conflict, but complement, like two bells tolling at different pitches, their resonance forming a harmony that vibrates through the stones. For the community of Israel, both voices were essential. The closeness of a God who calls, and the majesty of a God who cannot be seen. To lose either would have been to lose part of their identity. This weaving of intimacy and transcendence becomes one of the enduring legacies of Moses. He is at once shepherd and prophet, approachable yet set apart. His story carries the tension of both Judah and Israel, both J and E, bound into one figure who is never fully explained. And that, perhaps, is why his story endured. A leader too simple would have faded. A leader too remote would have failed to inspire. But a leader caught between earth and heaven, this is a figure who can speak across centuries. The debate continues even now. Some modern voices insist that J and E are inventions of scholars, that the text is seamless if read with reverence. Others counter that the evidence is undeniable, the seams visible to any careful reader. In this argument lies the same tension as the voices themselves: closeness and distance, faith and criticism, devotion and doubt. The text itself seems to invite both, as though it refuses to settle on one voice. Step closer to the parchment. You hear the scribe chanting J's account, his voice warm like evening air. Another scribe answers with E's words, his voice cool, distant, like wind over high ridges. The chant rises and falls, weaving intimacy and awe into one sacred thread. And in that moment, you realize that contradiction is not failure. It is the very essence of the story, a reminder that the divine cannot be caged in one image alone. The Templar bell tolls in the distance, reminding us again that opposites can stand side by side, joined by faith and ritual. In their silence and steel, the knights carried contradictions as surely as the scribes carried J and E. And from that resonance, something enduring was forged. The voices prepare now to give way to others, to the solemn cadence of covenant and the meticulous order of priesthood. But before we step into those halls, we linger once more between north and south. Intimacy and distance, shepherd's field and prophet's dream, listening as their echoes fade into the night. The choir continues, and now two new voices rise to the surface, carrying the weight of exile, law, and sacred order. Where J and E sang of intimacy and transcendence, of God near and God distant, D and P bring a different tone altogether. Their words are forged not in the ease of vineyards or windswept highlands, but in the crucible of national collapse, displacement, and the desperate need for continuity. The Deuteronomist, D, is the voice of covenant laid bare in thunder. His cadence is legal, sermonic, unrelenting. He speaks as though addressing a court, listing blessings for obedience and curses for rebellion. His words carry the heat of exile when Israel's world was crumbling under Babylon's weight. D is the prosecutor and the defender all at once, explaining ruin as divine justice, yet also promising restoration if only the covenant is renewed. His Moses stands like a prophet at the end of days, warning, pleading, demanding that the people choose life and blessing over death and curse. By contrast, the priestly writer, P, is calm, deliberate, measured like the steps of a ritual. He writes of genealogies, sacrifices, garments of priests, dimensions of sacred objects. To some, his words seem tedious, a litany of rules and numbers. Yet beneath the surface lies a vision of survival. When the temple lay in ruins, when the land was lost, P crafted a portable sanctuary in text. He built a temple of words, an altar of ritual memory, so that even in exile, the people could remain a people. His laws, his measurements, his genealogies were not mere bureaucracy. They were scaffolding to keep identity intact. Step into the world of D. Imagine a weary crowd gathered at the edge of exile, hearing a sermon that thunders like a storm over the desert. The voice declares, "Your suffering is no accident, it is covenant. The collapse of your kingdom is the fruit of disobedience." Yet hope is not lost. If you return to the law, if you remember the commandments, then blessing will return. The people weep, not only from fear, but from recognition. They see in their ruin the outline of divine justice. In D's hands, history itself becomes a courtroom, and every famine, every invasion, every exile becomes evidence in a covenant lawsuit. Now step into the meticulous world of P. You see a scribe bent over parchment, carefully listing the lineage of priests, each name a lifeline to a shattered past. He records the cubits of the tabernacle, the colours of the priestly robe, the order of sacrifices. To modern eyes, it reads like dry bureaucracy, but to the exiles it was life. Without land, without temple, without throne, they had only memory. P ensured that memory had structure. He turned ritual into identity, so that even far from Zion, the people could enact their holiness. The quirks of their writing reflect their purposes. D repeats like a drumbeat, driving home the choice between blessing and curse, life and death. His rhetoric is insistent, urgent, as though every word must pierce the heart. P, on the other hand, writes with the rhythm of ritual. His texts list, repeat, and enumerate like the steady toll of a bell. To some it may seem monotonous, but monotony can be sacred. The repetition itself becomes prayer, anchoring the people in exile. Debate circles around both voices. Some argue that D reflects a single author, perhaps from the time of King Josiah, shaping reform in Jerusalem before exile deepened the wound. Others see D as the voice of multiple generations, revised during and after exile to explain disaster. With P, the debate is sharper still. Was P a priestly elite, grasping for power in exile, turning law into control? Or was P a saviour of identity, ensuring survival when temple and monarchy had collapsed? To some, he is manipulative. To others, visionary. The truth may lie between, for power and survival are often entangled. The Templars, if they had held these scrolls, would have recognized both impulses. They too lived with sermons of obedience and ritual of order. Their own rules bound them with blessings and curses. Obey, and the order thrives. Betray, and ruin follows. Their rituals, their uniforms, their liturgies, all mirrored the work of P, building a portable temple of identity within their own order. And their sense of covenant echoed D, for the Templars lived under vows as binding as law, sworn before God, sealed with the threat of curse and the promise of eternal blessing. Imagine a knight hearing D's thunder. Obey the covenant, or face ruin. He would have known those words well, for the Templar's life was one of obedience, failure measured not only in battle, but in loyalty. Now imagine him reading P's meticulous laws, every cubit measured, every ritual described. He would have seen in them not tedium, but familiarity. His own life was ruled by detail, the length of a prayer, the form of a salute, the repetition of vows. P's order would have resonated like the rule of his own order, building holiness through structure. And so the voices of D and P bring the story of Moses into new terrain. They are less about the man himself and more about the survival of a people. Moses becomes not just liberator, but lawgiver, priest, prophet, a figure through whom covenant and ritual are sealed. His story shifts from the immediacy of exodus to the endurance of exile, from miracles to memory, from event to institution. The debate lingers, unresolved. Was D primarily theological, explaining suffering as justice? Or was it political, shaping a defeated people into obedience? Was P primarily manipulative, preserving priestly power? Or was he a visionary, crafting identity when identity itself was in danger of extinction? The scrolls do not answer. They whisper both possibilities, leaving us to wonder whether survival itself is ever free of power. Step closer to the parchment. Hear D's sermon thunder like a storm over dry ground, each word a choice between life and death. Hear P's steady chant, listing names, garments, cubits, sacrifices, a rhythm that steadies trembling hands in exile. Together, they form a brace, a structure that allowed a people to endure. The Templar bell tolls faintly in the distance, echoing their rhythm, reminding us that survival is built not only on battlefields, but on words, vows, and rituals that outlast kingdoms. The path now bends toward the editors who wove these voices together, for J and E sang of intimacy and transcendence, D thundered of covenant, P built temples in words. Yet none of them stand alone. In the final scrolls, they are woven, their contradictions preserved, their voices bound into one story. The next step is to gaze upon that final weaving, to see how the editors stitch together a tale that ends not with triumph, but with an unfinished line. Moses dying before the land of promise. The bell waits, the scrolls rustle. The seamstresses of scripture prepare to enter the stage. The scrolls rustle in the lamplight, and the voices of J, E, D, and P fade into one another, no longer distinct, but drawn together by invisible hands. Somewhere, in rooms filled with murmurs and smoke, redactors, editors before the name existed, gathered these disparate strands and stitched them into the form we know today. Their craft was not to erase, but to weave. They did not silence contradictions. They enshrined them, believing that in the friction of voices lay a deeper harmony. What emerged was not history in the modern sense, but a sacred tapestry, binding a fractured people to one story. To imagine the work of these editors is to picture artisans at a loom, pulling threads of many colours. From J they drew intimacy, from E transcendence, from D thunderous covenant, from P the order of ritual. Rather than cutting away what did not fit, they placed the threads side by side, letting knots and overlaps remain. The result is why we sometimes read two accounts of the same event. Water brought from a rock twice, commandments given and given again, divine names shifting within a breath. These duplications are not mistakes, but deliberate inclusions. The editors chose fullness over neatness, believing the divine could dwell in paradox. Consider the scene of Moses' death. He climbs the mountain, sees the land promised to his people, and dies before crossing the river. It is a curious ending, one that refuses triumph. Why not let the liberator enter the land? Why not give him the glory of fulfillment? The answer lies perhaps in the editor's vision. By leaving the story unfinished, they made Moses into a perpetual bridge, a figure whose work is never complete, whose journey must be carried on by every generation. His death before entry is not failure, but invitation. The covenant continues beyond the leader into the life of the community. Step closer in imagination to that editorial chamber. A scribe unrolls two versions of a story. In one, God speaks directly. In another, through an angel. He does not choose one over the other. He writes them both, one after the other, letting the tension remain. Another scribe sets down genealogies from P beside the fiery sermons of D. The result is uneven, yet alive. The text becomes a living argument, a dialogue across centuries. To read it is to join that argument, to be pulled into the work of interpretation. This deliberate preservation of contradiction may unsettle modern readers, who prefer coherence and singular authority. Yet in the world of the scribes, contradiction was a strength. It meant no tribe was excluded, no tradition erased. The law belonged to all because it bore the fingerprints of all. In the friction of voices, unity was found, not by erasure, but by endurance. The Templars, who lived by vows that bound monk and knight, prayer and battle, would have recognized the wisdom of this, for they too lived with contradiction, and they too believed that truth could be held in paradox. One can almost hear a knight whispering in the crypt, authority that rests only on the sword is fragile, but authority that rests on words, layered and reinterpreted, endures. The editors knew this. They built not a fortress of stone, but a fortress of text, strong enough to survive exile, conquest, dispersion. Their fortress had no walls but lines of ink, no towers but repeated laws, no gates but the chants of priests. And yet it stood when kingdoms fell. The quirks of this final weaving are everywhere. Repeated stories appear like echoes, as though memory itself insists on being heard twice. Shifts in divine names suggest different communities whispering their truths into the same scroll. Laws overlap, sometimes contradict, reflecting not confusion, but the layering of generations. To study these quirks is to see the fingerprints of the redactors, the quiet hands who shape scripture, not by erasing, but by preserving. Debate surrounds their motives. Some argue they sought harmony, smoothing rival traditions into a single narrative. Others contend they embraced discord, letting contradictions remain so the text would invite perpetual interpretation. Still others suggest politics. By weaving all traditions, the editors secured legitimacy for the whole nation, not just one tribe or faction. Whatever their motive, the result was extraordinary. A text at once fractured and unified, unfinished, yet enduring. Imagine now the final passage written, the ink drying as the scribe sets down his reed. Moses lies dead on Mount Nebo, his eyes having seen but not touched the promise. The people stand on the cusp of the land, leaderless yet bound by covenant. The story halts there, abruptly, refusing closure. It is not a conclusion, but a threshold. Every reader who comes after is invited to step across, to complete what Moses could not. This is the genius of the editors. They left the story open, alive, demanding continuation. The Templars, with their hidden chests and whispered rituals, would have felt kinship with this strategy. Their order too was built on texts and vows, repeated, guarded, interpreted anew with each generation. They knew that the true power of a story lies not in its ending but in its endurance, in its ability to compel new voices to join. To them, Moses' unfinished journey would have seemed a mirror. Their own task was never finished, their vigil never complete. The bell that tolled in their chapels was not closure, but continuation, a call to keep watch into the next night. Step closer to the parchment. Feel the rough fibers under your fingers. the uneven ink where one scribe's hand gave way to another. Hear the layers of voices, the contradictions that hum like counterpoint. The text is not a monologue, but a symphony, each instrument distinct yet part of one music. The editors were not composers, but conductors, drawing sound from many players, leaving the dissonance intact so that the music would never end. The fortress of text stands still, weathering centuries, holding its contradictions like treasures. And as you lean closer, you realize the contradictions are the treasure. They remind us that truth is not simple, that faith is not linear, that community is not built on uniformity, but on the endurance of difference. This is the secret the editors left us, and perhaps the secret the Templars guarded in their chests. The bell tolls once more, echoing through stone and parchment. The editors step back from their work, leaving a story that ends without ending, a covenant that waits to be renewed. From their weaving, we move now into the heart of symbolism itself, into the burning bush, the parted sea, the mountain of covenant, devices of story that carry authority beyond words. The scroll trembles, the torches flicker, and the path draws us toward the language of miracle, where narrative itself becomes law. The story now opens like a scroll illuminated with fire, water, and stone. We have heard the voices woven together, preserved in contradiction. Yet to grasp their full power, we must step into the symbols themselves. The Exodus is not remembered through dates or chronicles, but through images that burn into the imagination. The bush alight yet unconsumed, the sea split like a curtain, the thunder of Sinai as covenant is forged. These are not merely episodes. They are devices of storytelling, lenses through which authority is claimed, power established, memory sanctified. First comes the burning bush, a flicker of flame in the wilderness. Moses, a shepherd wandering the barren slopes, sees the impossible. Fire without ash, flame without smoke, light without destruction. The image is more than miracle. It is initiation. Here, authority is bestowed not by lineage or conquest, but by encounter with the divine. The bush is less about spectacle than about validation. It declares, "This man speaks with God's sanction." In ancient literature, fire often marked thresholds, the moment one crosses from ordinary to sacred. To approach the bush is to step into the role of prophet. And from then on, Moses is no longer just a fugitive shepherd, but a vessel of command. The story of the Red Sea is another device, thunderous and unforgettable. Whether one imagines walls of water rising like glass, or simply a strong wind driving back the tide, the point is not natural mechanics, but symbolic reversal. Pharaoh's might, chariots and spears are humbled before the breath of God. The liberation of slaves becomes not a quiet escape, but a cosmic drama. The sea itself bowing to the covenant. It is a story of identity. To pass through the waters is to be reborn, a people baptized into nationhood. Later generations, living under exile or oppression, would cling to this image as promise. The sea would always part again, if only one trusted the covenant. Then comes Sinai, the mountain wreathed in smoke and thunder. Lightning splits the sky, trumpet blasts echo across stone, and the people tremble at the foot of the peak. The mountain becomes a throne room, and the law given there is more than law. It is covenant, constitution, binding treaty. Ancient Near Eastern cultures knew the language of treaties, written with blessings and curses, sealed by ceremony. At Sinai, the same form is transfigured into divine command. The imagery is overwhelming, meant to inspire awe and fear. Authority is sealed in the sight of all, not hidden in visions of one man alone. The covenant is communal, witnessed by a nation. Step closer and imagine yourself among the crowd. The ground quakes. The air smells of rain and stone. Thunder rolls like drums of war. You shield your eyes from the lightning, yet you cannot look away. The voice of law does not arrive in whispers, but in a storm that engraves memory deeper than ink. You feel your body tremble, your knees weaken. In that moment, obedience is not a choice, but a necessity. The narrative achieves its purpose. It compels surrender not by sword, but by awe. The quirk of these images lies in their persistence. They return in retelling after retelling, duplicated across traditions. Some accounts linger on detail, others simplify, but always the bush burns, the sea parts, the mountain thunders. It is as though the editors understood that repetition itself engraves authority. To tell the miracle twice is not a contradiction, but reinforcement. Memory thrives on echoes. The Templars, repeating prayers in every vigil, chanting psalms through the night, would have recognized this instinct. Authority is ritualized through repetition until it no longer feels like story, but like truth etched into the marrow of the people. Debate surrounds these symbols. Are they rooted in real phenomena? Perhaps a brushfire of desert resin, a storm surge driven by wind, a volcanic eruption shaking a distant mountain? Or are they purely literary, crafted for theological effect? Scholars disagree, their arguments circling without resolution. To some, the symbols are mythological flourishes, stories elevated beyond any historical core. To others, they are memory refracted, real events magnified by generations of retelling. The truth remains elusive, shimmering like heat above sand. Yet perhaps the point was never to record mechanics. The symbols function not as history, but as proclamation. They declare authority. Moses speaks for God. Israel is chosen. Law is sacred. The devices work because they bypass analysis and seize imagination. A burning bush, a divided sea, a thunderous mountain. Such images endure even when facts are forgotten. Authority rests not on evidence, but on vision. The Templars too understood this. Their power was not only military, but symbolic. The red cross on their cloaks, the secrecy of their rituals, the rumor of hidden relics. These symbols bound men together more securely than any contract. Picture a knight standing before an altar, torchlight casting shadows on stone. He chants words older than his order, words layered with meaning. He knows the power lies not in the factual origin of those words, but in the ritual repetition, the symbol that seals unity. When he hears of Moses before the burning bush, he recognizes the same mechanism, authority conferred through symbol. When he hears of the parted sea, he thinks of baptism, of rebirth through water. When he hears of Sinai, he hears the echo of vows sworn before God. These 5 great scenes, the bush, the confrontation with Pharaoh, the crossing of the sea, the covenant at Sinai, and the farewell speeches of Moses, are strung like pearls across the narrative. Each functioning as an axis of authority, they transform a fugitive into prophet, a crowd of slaves into a nation, a covenant into law that outlasts empire. To trace them is to trace the arc of legitimacy, from private encounter to public constitution. The editors placed them with care, ensuring that the story moved in crescendo, each miracle preparing for the next. The debate remains unsettled. Were these miracles events misunderstood, or metaphors crafted for persuasion? Was the Red Sea a storm surge or pure symbol? Was Sinai a volcanic tremor or a crafted theophany? Scholars divide, but the story does not falter. It continues to be read, chanted, reenacted, because its power lies in imagination, not geology. The contradictions do not weaken but strengthen, allowing each generation to find its own meaning in the symbols. Step into the scene once more. You stand at Sinai, the thunder rolling, the mountain veiled in smoke. Your skin prickles with fear. Your chest swells with awe. The words you hear are not only commandments, but identity, a covenant that will shape your descendants. The symbol becomes law. The vision becomes reality. And as the people bow, trembling yet bound, you realize the miracle has succeeded. Authority has been planted, deep and enduring. The Templar bell tolls faintly in the background of memory. The knights, watching by candlelight, knew that symbols outlast swords, that a bush burning without ash can inspire more loyalty than a fortress of stone. In their silence, they may have whispered that the true miracle is not fire or sea or thunder, but the way a story binds hearts. The symbols stand still, glowing across centuries, summoning reverence in each retelling. From the bush to the sea, from the mountain to the covenant, the imagery has built its fortress of meaning. And now, from symbols of awe, we must turn to their function in politics and survival. The next step leads into how these images were wielded, not only to sanctify, but to rule, to justify land and law, to bind obedience through narrative. The torches flicker lower, but the parchment still waits, ready to reveal the purpose behind the power. The torches burn lower, and in their flicker, another voice enters the chamber. Not the voice of Moses' scribes this time, but of dissent. For no story, however layered and luminous, travels unchallenged. Across centuries, scholars, believers, skeptics, and archaeologists have raised their own banners, insisting that the story of Moses is not mythic literature alone, but rooted in fact, or at least in echoes of fact. If we are to be honest wanderers in this labyrinth, we must pause here to let those arguments be heard. Only then can the story's symbolic power stand on fair ground. The first strand of counterargument appeals to archaeology. Some scholars point to settlements in the central highlands of Canaan around the late 2nd millennium BCE, villages that seem to appear suddenly, without clear predecessors. Could these be traces of migrants from Egypt? Groups who left bondage and settled on the hills? Pottery styles, house structures, and burial practices suggest a mixed origin, perhaps a blend of native Canaanites and newcomers carrying a different memory. Though no inscription names Moses, the silence of Egypt is balanced here by the sudden noise of new life on Canaanite soil. Another argument invokes Egyptian texts themselves. A single papyrus, known as the Ipuwer papyrus, describes chaos in Egypt, the river turning to blood, slaves rising against masters, the land thrown into turmoil. Some read these laments as uncanny parallels to the biblical plagues. Others dismissed them as common tropes of Egyptian literature, metaphors of disorder rather than chronicles of events. Yet for those who believe, the papyrus is a tantalizing shard of confirmation, a whisper from Egypt itself. Then there is the matter of Semitic names found in Egyptian records. A few inscriptions mention groups of slaves or laborers bearing names that sound like Hebrew. In one list, a man called Mose appears, a name strikingly similar to Moses. Was he the same man, a mere namesake, or nothing at all? The debate sharpens here, each side reading the name as evidence or coincidence. To some, it is a thread tying the Exodus to history. To others, it is a distraction, a single syllable stretched into myth. Step closer to these arguments, and you can feel the weight of longing beneath them. Archaeologists sifting through shards of pottery, scholars poring over faded papyri. Each hopes to catch even a glimmer of proof. For believers, confirmation would anchor faith in the bedrock of history. For skeptics, the lack of proof undermines the narrative's claim to reality. And so the debate rages, as enduring as the story itself. The Templars, had they read these arguments, might have smiled beneath their helms. They knew that history and faith rarely move in step. Their own legends, of secret relics, of buried treasure beneath Solomon's temple, were doubted in their own age, yet the whispers endured, because they served a function greater than fact. Authority often rests not on evidence, but on the imagination it compels. Still, the knights would have granted the dissenters their place, for a story untested by challenge risks becoming brittle. The quirks of this debate reveal its complexity. Some scholars insist that the Exodus must have happened, pointing to collective memory as too enduring to be invented whole. Others counter that collective memory often invents itself, creating myths to explain identity. The tale of Romulus and Remus, of Aeneas fleeing Troy, served Rome not as history, but as charter. Could Moses function the same way? A myth of origin crafted to sanctify a people's law? The arguments circle endlessly, neither side able to banish the other. To hear the dissent is to recognize the power of story itself. Even those who doubt cannot escape the tale. They must still respond, still interpret, still measure its claims. The silence of Egypt becomes an argument. The presence of a name in an inscription becomes a battlefield. The archaeology of hills becomes contested terrain. The debate proves the story's vitality. If it were irrelevant, no one would argue. Its very ability to provoke dissent is testimony to its endurance. Imagine sitting in a circle of scholars, each unrolling fragments of papyrus, each holding shards of pottery in lamplight. One argues fiercely that the highland villages prove migration. Another insists they prove nothing more than internal Canaanite development. A third points to Ipuwer, his voice trembling with excitement. A fourth shakes her head, reminding the others that metaphors are not maps. The air is thick with tension, yet beneath it all lies fascination. They are all drawn into the gravity of a story they cannot ignore. The Templar bell tolls faintly, as if reminding us of the balance between faith and doubt. The knights themselves were accused of heresy, their symbols doubted, their rituals condemned. They too lived under suspicion, their truth debated by outsiders. Perhaps this is why they would have seen value in letting the dissent speak. To silence the skeptic is to weaken the story. To allow challenge is to prove its resilience. The story of Moses survives, not because it is beyond doubt, but because it thrives within doubt. The debate extends into modern times, where some archaeologists propose that the Exodus was never a single event, but a slow process, groups leaving Egypt over centuries, memories later condensed into one epic. Others argue that the entire narrative is invention, a myth of liberation crafted during exile to inspire unity, and still others maintain faith in its historicity, awaiting the day when spade and brush uncover the missing evidence. None prevail completely. All remain part of the conversation. Step closer now, and listen to the silence between arguments. That silence is the same as Egypt's silence, a space where imagination fills the void. Whether or not the Red Sea ever parted, whether or not Moses stood before Pharaoh, the story has already shaped law, faith, and identity for millennia. To deny its historicity is not to deny its power. To affirm its mythic quality is not to strip its meaning. The story holds authority not because it is proven, but because it is believed, retold, enacted. And so the dissenters take their place in the grand hall of memory. Their voices do not weaken the chant of scripture, but deepen it, adding layers of argument and interpretation. The burning bush still flickers. The sea still roars. Sinai still thunders, not because archaeology confirms it, but because imagination insists it. The contradictions, the silences, the The debates become part of the story itself, woven into its texture. The Templars, guardians of paradox, knew this truth well. Their order was both fact and legend, both military and mystical. They too survived because their story could not be settled. Perhaps this is the secret of Moses. His story endures because it cannot be pinned down, because it demands both belief and argument. The torches burn lower still, shadows lengthening across parchment and stone. From the voices of dissent, we now return to the heart of the story's power. Not in swords or armies, but in the authority of text itself, in law written and preserved, in words that outlive empires. The path leads us from debate into law, from archaeology into covenant, where authority is forged not by conquest, but by inscription. The scroll waits, the bell tolls, and the covenant of words begins to unfold. The night deepens, and the flicker of torches settles into a steady glow, illuminating not swords or crowns, but parchment. Authority has shifted now. No longer is it a matter of miracles or debates over memory, but of words. Words carved, copied, recited until they became stone in the minds of a people. The story of Moses is, at its heart, not the tale of a warrior, but of a lawgiver. And in that transformation lies its genius. Law that comes not from the blade, but from the script, from text that binds more tightly than chains. At Sinai, the law is not whispered in secret to a king or prophet alone. It is spoken before a nation, carved into tablets, placed into an ark, and carried as a living constitution. This is what makes it endure. Authority that rests on the sword dies when the sword breaks. Authority that rests on parchment can be renewed, interpreted, expanded. It can survive exile, conquest, dispersion. It can live wherever words can be spoken. In this sense, Moses becomes less liberator than legislator, a figure whose power outlasts miracles. Step closer in imagination to the scene of inscription. A scribe sharpens his reed, dips it into ink, and slowly forms letters on parchment. Another chisel carves lines into stone, the dust falling like incense. Around them, a people gather, listening to the words repeated aloud. You shall, and you shall not. The rhythm is steady, hypnotic, like the tolling of a bell. Each commandment is not only law, but liturgy. The repetition is deliberate, a mnemonic device, binding memory and obedience together. To obey is to remember. To remember is to belong. The quirks of this textual authority are easy to overlook. Laws are often duplicated, sometimes altered in detail. A command given once in Exodus appears again in Deuteronomy, phrased slightly differently. To modern eyes, these duplications look like contradictions, but to the ancient community, they were reminders, reinforcing truth through variation. Just as a priest chants the same psalm in different tones, so the law is chanted in different words, embedding itself deeper with each repetition. Debate arises over this system of authority. Was it liberation, giving the people a law to live by, making holiness portable? Or was it control, a way for priests and scribes to govern through text? Some argue that the commandments represent a radical democratization of law, placing divine will into the hands of all. Others see in it the hand of elites, crafting rules that kept the community dependent on their interpretation. The truth may be both. Law can liberate and restrain, inspire and dominate, all at once. The Templars would have recognized this double edge. Their own order was bound by written rule, the rule of the temple, recited and enforced in detail. Every action, from the way they prayed to the way they ate, was prescribed. To some, this was oppression. To others, liberation from chaos. Within rule lay identity. A knight without vows was a mercenary. A knight under rule was a Templar. Authority rested not in the sword at his side, but in the vows spoken and preserved in parchment. The parallel to Sinai would not have been lost on them. Picture a knight kneeling in candlelight, reciting vows from memory. His head is bowed, his hands steady on the hilt of a sword he must promise never to use except under rule. The law binds him, not the steel. In this, he is kin to the Israelite at Sinai, who recites commandments that dictate not only battle, but daily bread, not only worship, but the rhythm of work and rest. The law reaches into every corner of life, shaping identity not by might, but by memory. The repetition of law also creates continuity. In exile, without temple or throne, the people could still gather to read. The scroll became their sanctuary, their ark, their fortress. Even in foreign lands, the covenant could be remembered and obeyed. No conqueror could strip them of this authority, because it was not bound to a place, but to a practice. This is the subtle strength of textual power. It disperses, yet endures, fragile in parchment, yet indestructible in memory. The quirks of ritualized reading deepen this endurance. The commandments were not left to silent parchment, but were spoken aloud, chanted in assemblies, woven into festivals. Each retelling renewed the covenant, not as a relic, but as a living act. This rhythm of repetition, steady as a monk's chant or a knight's vigil, turned law into breath. The Templars, chanting psalms through the night, would have understood that authority is maintained not once, but through continual reenactment. Yet debate remains. Can a law that claims divine origin truly be free from human manipulation? Priests copied, interpreted, and sometimes altered the text. Kings invoked it to justify their reigns. Prophets wielded it to challenge those same kings. Authority in text is never neutral. It is always contested. But this contestation is itself a sign of vitality. A dead law is ignored. A living law is argued over, fought over, reinterpreted. The story of Moses thrives because the law he is said to have given continues to be contested. Step closer and hear the rhythm of words spoken in assembly. Hear, O Israel. The chant echoes steady and sure. It is both prayer and law, both devotion and governance. The authority here is not enforced by soldiers, but by community. To belong is to recite, to obey, to remember. The law becomes the spine of identity, as essential as blood. The Templars, too, knew the danger of this. When accused of heresy, their own laws and vows were twisted by outsiders. The very authority that bound them was turned against them, leading to their downfall. Yet even in ruin, their legend survived, because the memory of their vows was stronger than the swords that destroyed them. In this they shared the paradox of Israel. Authority, fragile on parchment, indestructible in imagination. The scrolls close softly, yet the echo of words remains. Law has proven more enduring than miracle, more potent than conquest. It shapes identity across exile, survives silence, and thrives in debate. Its authority lies not in the steel of enforcement, but in the ink of memory. And as the Templar bell tolls once more, we are reminded that words are sharper than swords, for they cut not bodies, but time itself. From here, the path leads outward again, beyond Israel, beyond Sinai, into the wider world. For the model of law as authority, of text as constitution, would not remain bound to one people. It would cross borders, seep into empires, echo through Christianity, Islam, and even secular politics. From parchment to cathedral, from mosque to courthouse, the legacy of Moses would ripple outward. The knights knew this well, standing on the threshold of Temple Mount, hearing the resonance of many traditions. And so, The story prepares to step into that wider influence, where the covenant of words becomes a bridge across cultures. The path stretches outward now, from the wilderness of Sinai to the stony plateau of Jerusalem, from the trembling of a people before thunder to the solemn silence of a night before an altar. The legacy of Moses does not remain confined to Israel's memory. It expands, carried into Christianity and Islam, adapted into the frameworks of nations and empires, and echoed even in secular charters of law. If we listen closely, we can hear the same rhythm of covenant and law tolling across the ages, like the bell of the Templars carried on night winds over Temple Mount. Christianity took Moses as both ancestor and foreshadowing. The Gospels present Christ as a new Moses, a lawgiver on a mountain, feeding crowds in the wilderness, leading not out of Egypt, but out of sin. The Sermon on the Mount is a deliberate echo of Sinai, recasting covenant in the key of grace. For early Christians, the unfinished ending of Moses' story, dying before the land, was not failure but prophecy. It prepared the way for fulfillment in another figure, another covenant. Thus, the model of authority through text and teaching did not vanish but was reborn in liturgy, sacrament, canon. Islam too embraces Moses, or Musa, as prophet, lawgiver, and liberator. The Quran retells the story with its own cadence. Pharaoh's arrogance, the staff turned serpent, the sea parting. Here again, Moses is not just historical but archetypal, a figure through whom God's authority confronts worldly power. The Quran's telling makes the story immediate, not distant, reminding believers that divine liberation is ever present. In mosques from Damascus to Cairo, the chant of Musa's story becomes instruction and warning, echoing Sinai's thunder across another tradition. Beyond religion, the model of Moses seeped into secular imagination. Lawgivers of the Enlightenment, founders of constitutions, invoked the image of a leader who delivers not by sword, but by statute. From Puritan settlers in New England imagining themselves as a new Israel, to revolutionaries in France and America who drew on the imagery of covenant. The shadow of Moses guided the birth of nations. Even where faith waned, the archetype remained. Authority rooted in text. Identity shaped by law. Leaders measured by their ability to articulate principles greater than themselves. Step closer in thought to Temple Mount, the ground where these traditions converge. Beneath its stones, the Templars carved their chambers, guarding secrets whispered to have come from ages past. Some legends claim they unearthed manuscripts, fragments of forgotten laws, writings that carried the scent of Sinai. Others believe they guarded relics that symbolize covenant itself. Whether truth or tale, the belief reveals something deeper, that the Templars saw themselves not merely as warriors, but as custodians of memory. They were a bridge, carrying forward the authority of law across ages, linking Moses' covenant to their own vows. Imagine the night on guard. At night, the city of Jerusalem hushed under stars. He leans on his sword, but his thoughts dwell not on battle, but on parchment hidden beneath stone. In his heart, he hears the echo of Moses, a man who never entered the land, but whose law outlasted kingdoms. The night, too, may never see the world his order dreams of, but his vigil keeps the bridge intact. The power of Moses is not conquest, but continuity, and the night becomes its silent guardian. The quirks of this transmission are striking. Symbols shift and mutate, yet the structure remains. Law given, covenant sealed, authority grounded not in might, but in sacred text. The Christian cross overlays the tablets of Sinai. The Quran reframes the plagues and sea. Constitutions echo the covenantal form of blessings and obligations. Each tradition reshapes the story, but none discards it. Moses becomes a vessel into which each age pours its own meaning. Debate arises here as well. Did the Templars truly uncover scrolls beneath Temple Mount? Or did later generations weave that rumour into their legend, granting them an aura of mystery? Some historians dismiss the claim as invention, a romantic tale to magnify the order's mystique. Others wonder whether fragments of ancient commentary, perhaps even genealogical lists or ritual texts, could have surfaced in their hands. We cannot know for certain. What matters is that the legend endured, shaping how people saw the Templars, as not just soldiers, but keepers of sacred memory. This is where the bridge takes form most clearly, from Sinai to Temple Mount, from parchment to charter, from prophet to knight. The thread is one. Authority preserved through text, guarded by ritual, carried forward across ages. The unfinished death of Moses becomes the unfinished vigil of the Templars. Both embody the truth that sacred work is never complete, that each generation must renew the covenant, must keep watch in the night. Step closer, and you can almost hear the mingling of chants. A psalm sung by monks in a Templar chapel, the Quran recited in a mosque, Torah verses chanted in a synagogue. Different tongues, different cadences, but all drawing from the same mountain, the same covenant, the same archetype of authority through word. The stone of Jerusalem holds their echoes, each layer of prayer seeping into the walls. The Templars, standing guard, heard them all, and in their silence became bridge bearers. The bell tolls again, faint but steady. It calls not to battle but to memory, not to conquest but to continuity. The legacy of Moses stretches like a river across faiths and nations, carrying with it the principle that true authority is not seized by might, but entrusted through covenant, inscribed into text, enacted in community. The Templars, standing between sword and scripture, embodied that principle, however imperfectly. Their bridge spans the centuries, connecting Sinai's fire to the halls of kings, to the courts of law, to the whispered prayers of exiles. The path narrows now toward its end. The torches burn lower. The knights prepare to leave their vigil. One final section awaits, a wind down into stillness, where steel cools, bells fade, and the covenant settles into silence. There, in the hush, the story will close, not with conquest, but with blessing, not with triumph, but with rest. The bell that has tolled through our long wandering grows softer now, no longer the stern summons of battle or the solemn call of liturgy, but a gentle echo fading into mist. The Templar watch is nearly ended, their cloaks damp with dew, their swords laid aside. Around them, the city of Jerusalem lies still beneath the stars, its domes and walls luminous in moonlight, each stone carrying centuries of prayer and silence. The story of Moses has travelled with us across deserts and mountains, through parchments and arguments, through miracles and contradictions, and now it settles like dust in twilight. To see Moses at the end is to see him unfinished. He climbs Mount Nebo, gazes across the Jordan, and dies before entering the land. The editors left him there, poised at the threshold, so that each generation could step into the story as if it were their own. His life is less conclusion than invitation, a reminder that identity and covenant are never complete, but always in need of renewal. The unfinished ending becomes a wellspring of endurance, just as the Templars stood eternal vigil, never seeing the final fulfillment of their order's dream. So Moses remains the perpetual guardian of a promise still unfolding. The quirks of the tale remain like scattered embers, repeated laws, duplicated stories, contradictions between voices. All were left deliberately, the editors refusing to smooth them away. In those seams lies the secret of longevity, A simple story dies when questioned. A layered story endures because it can be read anew in every age. The Torah is not fragile parchment, but living architecture. Its walls built of difference, its roof open to interpretation. The knights, who preserved both relic and rumour, would have known that mystery is stronger than certainty, that a riddle lasts longer than an answer. Debate has circled endlessly. Was Moses a man of flesh and blood, a composite of many figures, or a creation of scribal imagination? Was the Exodus an event in history, a migration magnified, or a myth of origin crafted in exile? The silence of Egypt, the contradictions of text, the persistence of tradition, all resist resolution. Yet perhaps this irresolution is itself the message. For what survives is not the answer, but the story. Not the proof, but the retelling. In the persistence of the narrative, generation after generation, lies its truth. Step closer in your mind to the knight at the end of his vigil. His sword rests on cold stone, his head bowed in silence. The night is heavy with incense and the faint rustle of parchment hidden in chests. He knows that morning will come, but he will not live to see the final victory of his order, nor perhaps even the next chapter of their struggle. Yet he keeps watch, because the act itself is covenant. In that moment, he mirrors Moses on the mountain, seeing the promise, not entering, but guarding it for those who will. The legacy of Moses flows beyond faith into the veins of the world. Christianity reshaped him as prototype of Christ. Islam honored him as prophet. Secular revolutions borrowed his form for constitutions and covenants. The Templars, whether by relic or by rumor, bridged Sinai to their own vows, carrying the torch of law and identity across centuries. The thread remains unbroken, stretched but never snapped, weaving through temple, chapel, mosque, and courthouse. And like all enduring threads, it is strongest where it is frayed, where contradictions force renewal. The air grows cooler as dawn approaches. Mist gathers on the cloaks of the knights, their faces half in shadow, half in lamplight. One bell tolls faintly, not loud, but steady, as though marking the close of a vigil. The scrolls lie sealed once more, their words silent yet alive, waiting for the next hand to unroll them. In the hush, one feels the presence of all we have traced, the burning bush glowing in memory, the parted sea whispering in imagination, the thunder of Sinai echoing through time. These are not events to be proven or disproven, but symbols to be lived, rehearsed in ritual, reinterpreted in every age. The debate falls silent here, not because it is resolved, but because it is laid down like a sword beside the altar. In its place remains the quiet truth that stories endure because they are retold. Laws endure because they are recited. Identity endures because it is remembered. Moses stands on his mountain still, and the Templars keep their watch still, not as victors, but as guardians of memory. Their legacy is not conquest, but continuity. Not triumph, but the whisper of parchment in the dark. Step deeper into the stillness. Imagine the steel of a knight's blade cooling after long vigil. The last ember of a campfire sighing into ash. The long echo of a bell dissolving into silence. The night enfolds you, slow and steady, each breath deepening like the rhythm of ancient chants. The figures we have walked beside, scribes, prophets, editors, knights, fade now into mist, leaving only the quiet certainty that memory itself is sacred. And so the story rests. The bush still burns without consuming. The sea still parts in imagination. The mountain still thunders in ritual. The law still binds across centuries. And the bell of the Templars still tolls faintly across stone. All is unfinished, yet all is complete. May the night close gently around you. May the mist settle softly. May the bell of memory guide you into rest. Sleep now, beneath the shadow of Sinai and the silence of Temple Mount, where steel and parchment, fire and stone, promise and prayer all meet and keep their eternal watch.